Mike, you're back in the chair after a few weeks of travels. Brilliant to have you here.
Yes.
Don't sound so scared. But in honor of your recent travels, I thought we'd use, an app that is used on both sides of the pond, Waze, which helps you get from place to place. And its user prompt is, where to?
Well, as you mentioned, I've been traveling for the last few weeks, so where to is nowhere finally. I have been living out of a suitcase and on the road for almost 3 weeks, and I am happy, if exhausted, to be home and not trying to figure out train schedules or traffic or where the hell I was going, and I can just be home.
That's nice.
What about you? Where to?
Well, where to? Well, we've got a bunch of stories packed up in our suitcase. We're ready to jump into the Ctrl-Alt-Speech car, and we are heading to a better understanding of this week's stories about content moderation. So jump in for the ride. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It's July the 3rd, 2025, and this week's episode is brought to you with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund. This week, we're talking about the panic of misinformation, why it's still a bad time to be a moderator, and what Brazil's Supreme Court judgment means for the internet. I'm Ben Whitelaw, the founder and editor of Everything in Moderation, and I'm with Mike, who is in his office again. I can see him. He's not got a suitcase near him. Mike, great to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be back. There are suitcases actually right on the floor over there because I have not fully unpacked everything.
You got back late last night, didn't you? You're doing this with very little sleep.
Yeah, it was. I actually did get a fair amount of sleep last night, but that was just because I collapsed really early. But yeah, it's been a wild few weeks. But it was fun to listen to the 2 episodes that you did without me, which I thought were both really fascinating and very interesting. And I enjoyed listening to those while I was out and about. But happy to be back. Happy to be doing this again. I miss it when I'm not doing it.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to kind of process thoughts about some of these topics. I think Bridget Todd actually said that to me last week, perhaps when we weren't recording, but she says that the podcast that she does is her way of like consolidating and kind of organizing her thoughts on stuff. So I agree. When I don't do this, it all becomes a jumble. Listeners will tell us whether it actually sounds as coherent as it is.
Right.
But yeah, it's nice to have you here. We won't cover this story as one of our chosen stories today, but we wanted to touch on in the intro the big story that happened just after we recorded last week's podcast, the Supreme Court judgment on age verification that happened just at the kind of back end of last week. I know you've kind of written a bit about it. You've thought a lot about it. You've obviously been covering this topic a lot on TechDirt over the years. Do you want to give us a kind of a brief overview of the significance of that?
Sure. Yeah, this is the Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton case. And yeah, it came out last Friday. We thought it was going to come out Thursday, and both Thursday and Friday morning, I was like sitting in my hotel room while family was like trying to busy themselves and trying to deal with the expectation that the case would come out, and then it did come out on Friday. I would say it was a very bad and very problematic ruling, and we're going to be living with it for a long time. The nature of the case specifically was about adult content websites and a law in Texas that said that there had to be age verification on those websites. And that went against a number of precedents, specifically around the internet and attempts to deal with child-appropriate material and age verification in particular. And the Fifth Circuit in Texas originally had ruled, arguing that a different case from like the 1960s, I think, about age verification for adult magazines meant that this was justifiable and they could ignore the ruling. And what they really got at was sort of what standard you use to view these kinds of cases and whether or not they violate the First Amendment. And so the ruling that came out of the Supreme Court was 6-3. It was the sort of Republican-appointed justices against the Democratic-appointed justices. And the ruling was written by Clarence Thomas and really made a mess of a lot of First Amendment law in ways that I think we're going to be hearing about and dealing with for a long time. It didn't wipe out the idea that age verification could violate the First Amendment. And I think for people who think that the case means that now you can pass laws that say social media requires age verification, I don't think that the ruling goes that far. But it does open up a lot of language that means that states are going to try. And we're going to see a whole bunch of cases challenging them. And we're going to go back on this again. And people are going to quote some of the, I would argue, very, very sloppy and inexact language that Clarence Thomas used, and the failure of the majority opinion to really grapple with what it was that they were ruling, or to even really apply the standard that they said has to apply here. And so I think it's a very messy case. I think it was a very bad ruling. I think it's very problematic for free speech on the internet in general. I think it upends and really doesn't deal carefully with their earlier precedents, and in that sense actually weakens a lot of important precedents about speech online. And so that it worries me a lot.
Yeah, and lots of other privacy and security experts who've focused on kind of age verification, age assurance are also very concerned, it's worth saying. However, there is a large group of child kind of protection advocates who are celebrating this and what it could mean. And I think there are a lot of those people out there. There were probably people who listen to the podcast who also feel positive about this judgment. But you're right, it does open up a huge can of worms in terms of legal precedent. There's a couple of really good pieces. We've decided not to talk about it as some of our main stories today because well, partly because we did a big episode last week about age verification, and we talked about being a teen on the internet. That was with Bridget Todd. Definitely worth going back and have a listen to that. So we didn't want to do it twice in 2 weeks, but there is going to be more to say, and we expect this to come up in a future episode.
It's definitely going to, and there will be other cases, and sort of like the interpretation of what was said in this opinion is really going to matter. And so this is an issue that isn't going away, and we'll hear plenty about it. But yeah, I was pretty disappointed in the ruling. I think it's going to have widespread impacts that will generally be negative. And I think that even the people who are celebrating it will regret that celebration over time.
Yeah, indeed. Last week's episode was pretty punchy. It was, a sprightly 45-minute run through of the week. I don't expect this week to be the same, Mike, partly because you're back in the chair.
And are you saying I'm a little bit more verbose?
I'm saying that you have a lot to contribute. And also because the topics that we're going to be looking at are, they're pretty contentious. Starting with the first one that we'll bring out today. This is an equally as, I guess, difficult topic to really reconcile, and that is how damaging is misinformation.
Yeah.
And this comes on the back of a big report by a think tank, and then some additional commentary that you've noticed and are going to weave together to kind of help us understand this.
Yeah, so what happened was last week, David and Sarah at the Cato Institute put out this report called The Misleading Panic Over Misinformation and Why Government Solutions Won't Work. And the Cato Institute, for folks who don't know, it's a very traditionally libertarian think tank in Washington, D.C. They have a lot of stuff that I sometimes agree with. They have a lot of stuff that I disagree with. But traditionally, unlike some of the other think tanks in D.C., they have tended to be more principled and actually do stand by the things that they talk about. They have always, in the sort of traditional, again, like I hesitate to say this because libertarian means different things to like everybody. There's the famous quote, which I won't get exactly right, which is like, every libertarian has their own definition of libertarian, and it's what they are, and everybody else is wrong, is effectively the intent of the quote. But I think the Cato Institute is, they've always been very strong on like they're pro-immigration, they are pro-criminal justice reform. A lot of libertarian groups are really just right-wing front groups, and Cato Institute is not like that. And so this is, I think, fairly typical traditional libertarian, which again, like there's fewer and fewer of those in the online speech world, in that it goes through a pretty detailed analysis of how there is a moral panic about mis and disinformation. And this is certainly something that I've talked about in the past, that there's sort of this pervading belief out there at times that misinformation is like this toxic poison that if you are exposed to it, your brain will melt and you will believe any nonsense that is out there. And that's wrong, right? And I think it's important to state that that's wrong, because when you believe that misinformation is so toxic and so poisonous that it just will melt anyone's brain if they come into contact with it, then the solutions to how you deal with it are very, very different. And so I think it's important to have these kinds of things that push back on it. And I'm reminded of Joe Bernstein years ago wrote a really thoughtful piece for Harper's. They actually spent about a year researching, arguing that misinformation was overhyped often actually by the social media companies themselves, which sounds counterintuitive because they're often criticized for allowing misinformation. But his argument was that they actually sort of somewhat enjoyed the idea that misinformation, that any information on their services was so powerful that it could change minds and change perspectives, because that allowed them to go to advertisers and say, hey, if the information in our platform will bring about crazy conspiracy theories, just think of what it will do to get people to buy your widget.
Mhm.
And so I think there's
So
a
I-
lot of really thoughtful analysis on here in this piece that talk about why people are overreacting in some ways to misinformation, that the term misinformation is often used in a broad and vague way that allows people to put in all sorts of other information that some other people wouldn't consider misinformation. It allows, there's a lot of sort of overreacting or sort of overqualifying or giving too much power to the information for, let's say, electoral things that happen that they don't agree with. People are looking for something to blame. So I think the piece is really good in sort of laying that out. It also has some interesting ideas around solutions, including things that I have talked about and believe in strongly around giving more power to the end users and empowering them to, determine what sorts of content they want to see and what sorts of content they don't want to see. And so overall, I think there's a lot of really good stuff in here.
And just to clarify, Mike,
Yeah.
you're talking about the kind of protocols paper there,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
that's kind of some of the ideas that you wrote about there, and which have gone on to be fundamental to services like Blue Sky.
Yes.
Those are kind of picked up by this paper. Is that right?
So this paper certainly talks about those kinds of things. And so I think there's value in that. But the paper isn't perfect, and it's received some criticism. And some of the criticism I actually think is interesting and correct as well. And it's really interesting. It's sort of, one of the most vocal critics of the paper is Elliot Higgins, who's from Bellingcat. For people who don't know Bellingcat, which you should, it's like this open source. It's a journalism outfit, but they use open source information to expose all sorts of stuff. Is there a better way to describe Bellingcat?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they're like the kind of, I'd say, the creme de la creme of
Yes.
like OSINT and investigative journalism,
Yeah.
I would say.
They're investigative journalists. They've exposed all sorts of like crazy Russian conspiracy theories, and like they've done some really amazing work. I mean, I think they had figured out like who the assassins were who targeted Russian expats who were hiding out in Britain, who were assassinated and stuff like they've done some amazing work. And Elliot is very, very thoughtful. And so he has a criticism of the piece that basically says that they underplay the impact of misinformation. And I think he's also right. And so there's like, even though the Elliot really criticizes the paper, I think he's right that the Cato piece sort of brushes off the actual concerns with misinformation and assumes that because there is an overreaction and there is a moral panic and there are people who act as though misinformation is like this toxic, all-powerful, brain-controlling substance, that means we can dismiss it entirely. And Ellie's point is that that's not exactly true. And I think he's right that there are communities of folks who are so built up around misinformation that supporting their viewpoint becomes tribal, such that they're just looking for confirmation bias on everything, and that anyone who challenges those things must be wrong or evil, that it creates this sort of fractured society. And that's true, and we're seeing that. The question is, how do you deal with that? And that, I don't think, so people who sort of look at Ellie's view might think that the way to deal with it is like, well, you have to crack down on misinformation. And that's certainly the view that a lot of politicians are taking. But it doesn't deal with the sort of difficulties of that or how that expands, or what the Cato paper fears is that when you say, well, the regulations have to crack down on misinformation, well, who defines what that is? And it opens up this possibility of governments coming in and saying, Trump runs around all the time and says fake news this, fake news that. If you allow regulations to take that on, you actually may empower more of the kind of problems that people are afraid of here.
Yeah, and the irony is that these two pieces, this kind of broader debate, is happening in the same week that the EU's voluntary code of conduct on disinformation, which we talked about in various guises in the past. It was the kind of center of the beef between Thierry Breton, the former EU commissioner, and Elon Musk. And there have been kind of many battlegrounds over which like that has been fought, actually became part of the Digital Services Act this week. So it became a kind of formalized part of the DSA, which is only going to, I think, further anger folks working for platforms and for probably US elected officials, including Jim Jordan, who I'm sure has taken note on this. But yeah, so the timing is very ironic, as you say, and there's a whole kind of sideline of concerns about what that might lead to.
Yeah, and there's a battle here, and I think it's actually important to lay out one of the factors of this battle, which is that you can argue that misinformation and disinformation is having an impact and is a problem and is something that society needs to deal with. But then the question is who and how, right? And so I've already raised the concerns that I have about putting that emphasis on the government because they will abuse that power to their own advantage, often to the disadvantage of, say, their political rivals. But then the question is, should it be the platforms themselves that have to deal with that? And that leads to other problems and other concerns. And so the sort of DSA approach is effectively like, we're going to force the platforms to deal with it, which I think is not a good solution either. I do think that platforms may have their own responsibility to deal with certain kinds of mis and disinformation, but that is something that they need to figure out on their own effectively. Where this all comes down to is like all of these things, I think, take a step back, are like societal level issues. Like society is a mess right now. People are extremely messy. And we're sort of dealing with the consequences of some of that globally and discovering that like there are a lot of messes to solve. And the idea that we're going to solve them by the EU telling Mark Zuckerberg to remove disinformation, I don't think that's the issue. I don't think that fixes things. And I think that the people who are complaining about the Cato paper seem to think that there's some sort of magic wand that you can wave that causes, well, if only social media were better about handling this stuff, it would magically solve these things. And I don't think we've seen that to be true. And in fact, while people will argue with me, people will look at like the world today and they'll look at Trump and everything that he's doing and say, well, that is because of social media misinformation. But you could just as easily and with just as much credibility probably argue that Trump being elected last year was backlash to the companies overreacting, right? And this was the argument that Mark Zuckerberg made, right? Like that they got so much pressure around COVID and Trump and other things that they overreacted and pulled down too much information. And there was a backlash and there were alternative services and people were mad and saying like, oh, they're trying to censor us. A lot of that is not true, as we've discussed in detail, but it's giving off that narrative. And if the idea is that, oh, the EU now steps in and tells these companies that they have to do this thing, you're going to get a similar kind of backlash. It's bad faith and it's motivated by ridiculous people, but you have to take that into account. These are larger societal things and you don't fix them with a magic wand and you don't fix them by telling Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk that they have to moderate in the way that you want. That's just not how it works. You really have to get at the underlying issues. And nobody really wants to talk about that, including the Cato paper, which, talks about some of the problems. And Elliot's piece talks about some of the problems. And I sort of joked before we started recording that it's like the classic blind men and the elephant, all sort of looking at different parts of the problem, but nobody has a complete solution because the world is messy.
Yeah, and there's a third set of eyes looking at the elephant that we should talk about, a third piece that we'll bring into this. But just on Elliot's piece for Byline Times, I mean, the point that he makes is that actually the fact that the misinformation kind of proliferates in cases like COVID, in cases like QAnon, in cases like elections, has led to people becoming kind of unable to have conversations and reasoned debate with each other. So they're basically, these two pieces, the Cato paper and the kind of op-ed, are almost suggesting that the cause is different. They're putting the cause as either misinformation or as it being the kind of result of the societal problems that you mentioned. And I just think that's almost unresolvable. I think, and then the third piece that we'll come on to is something that I was thinking about as well. Like, we just don't have a collective, almost agreed view of the problem that is misinformation.
Right.
It's like the kind of definition of a wicked problem.
Yes.
In that it's difficult to define, there's no solution, and there are kind of conflicting interests about how to resolve it. Like, are we just going to go round and round in circles forever talking about the problem of misinformation? Or is it just because this is a relatively new phenomenon on the internet?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, and I'm going to take a slightly circuitous route to answer your question here. But like,
Yeah.
I noticed a thing, like I sort of presented Elliot's piece as if he was supporting the idea of like regulatory demands on moderation, but he's not. And it's funny in some ways because he is kind of arguing for better discourse, right? Like more thoughtful discourse, more of an approach towards truth. And you could argue that the Cato piece is arguing the same thing. It talks about the marketplace of ideas and more speech. But Eliot is sort of arguing that like right now we're seeing bad faith actors sort of take over these marketplaces, leading to things where it's all tribal. It's not about actually finding truth. It's not about using the marketplace of ideas to find truth. But he still wants this wider discussion that is focused on truth. He's looking for ways to sort of create more of a liberal approach towards, how do we get the world to agree on certain basic facts? And so to get to your question, like we're in this moment of upheaval, and it's, the comparison has been made many times by many people, and I'm certainly not the first, and I'm cribbing on the work that lots of experts have done. But like when the printing press first came about, it took society a very long time, arguably 100 to 200 years to figure out how do we deal with this? Whereas all of the information before this was held by a few people, and everybody else, the populace, had no access to the sort of written word other than what was sort of shared with them by, often priests. And there was kind of a lot of upheaval in those 100 to 200 years as sort of people learned to deal with it. And eventually we sort of came to this conclusion that, more information is probably better, and access to information and educating the populace and things like that was important. But it took time and it was messy. And I think we're going through a similar sort of thing right now where the means of production of information has expanded massively, and the ability to distribute that information and also to monetize it, which is relevant because you have the sort of grifter class that weighs in as well, which will do anything for money, as we've talked about as well. You sort of have this very messy situation where it has to be a societal level conclusion of like, we have to agree on what is ground truth and how do we view it and how do we learn about it and how do we teach people about it. And it's why like I talk about media literacy as being such an important component to this. And people always mock that and say like, that's no answer. And basically what people are saying when they say that's no answer is that that's too difficult an answer, right? And that takes too long. Like we got to start with kids and teach them how to understand what's real and what's not real, and how to understand when people are lying to you and what the motivations are and what incentive structures are out there. And again, like not everybody's going to agree, but that is the nature of humanity and stuff. Like, and this is where I also think we do ourselves something of a disservice in the debate over mis and disinformation about this idea that there are certain things that are facts and there are certain things that are untrue. And like, yes, there are facts and there are lies, but like there's so much in between where you take something that is factual but is presented in a way that distorts it, or you take something that is false but has an element in there that's true, or you present something that is like doesn't tell the whole story. Like that's the stuff that we're dealing with all the time. That's the stuff that's really problematic, and that's the stuff that you can't deal with by saying, "Oh, that's a misinformation." Just because you only present half the story, like you've presented half the story and you didn't present anything wrong, but you left out a lot of the context. That's a different problem than just pure misinformation. If it's pure misinformation, if it's just blatantly false information, then there's like ways to deal with it. But that's not where the really problematic stuff tends to come in. It's when, you're presenting stuff out of context or in a distorted way, or to aim for confirmation bias. There's a whole bunch of things, and we don't have easy ways of dealing with that.
Yeah, it's the messy middle again. And if I was to kind of characterize, I guess, these two pieces, simplistically as like the Cato paper being pro marketplace of ideas, pro free expression, pro speech in its kind of broader sense, and the Eliot op-ed being slightly more kind of interventionist, kind of a bit more of an creating kind of structures and ways and means of like countering misinformation to some degree. Then our third piece that we wanted to flag, it's almost like somewhere in between.
Yes.
Isn't it? It's about the idea that there are kind of stakeholders, as you say, who are sitting in between, making the decisions, the difficult decisions about what speech to allow, and this idea of kind of editorial discretion and content moderation fundamentally. Talk about this piece by René de Rester.
Yeah, so this is by Renee, and lots of people here, listening to this, I'm sure know Renee DiResta. And so she wrote a piece for Law and Liberty, which is also another sort of traditional libertarian publication called Content Moderation is Not Censorship. And it's actually a response to somebody else's piece, Tori Tinsley's piece called When Social Media Obscures Truth. And that piece argued sort of against the idea, how social media content moderation is censorship and they shouldn't be in the business of determining what is and what is not true. And so Renee wrote a piece sort of criticizing that and basically saying like, that's not a fair way to characterize what content moderation is, because everybody has to do some sort of content moderation and you're making decisions and everything is a choice. And also not all content moderation is just taking down content. And this is a piece that I think a lot of people, there's this concept like beyond leave up and take down.
Mm-hmm.
And Renee talks about how actual enforcement tends to fall into three different buckets: remove, reduce, or inform. And everybody focuses on the remove, which is like the takedown, but like the reduce, but I mean, reducing the visibility of it, or whether or not it trends in an algorithm, or inform is to add more information to it, which is a marketplace of ideas. It's more speech. It's flagging the content and adding some context or something along those lines. And these are all things that are part of that discussion. And it's interesting to then compare that back to the Elliott piece, where he talks about at one point that we need systems in place that help people evaluate competing claims. And what he's really talking about is adding context, which is a form of more speech. And he mentions he doesn't want to impose a single truth, which is the argument that the Tinsleys of the world or that the Cato piece sort of suggests that the social media companies are trying to do, that they're trying to enforce. This is the single truth. But he's saying we need to defend the process by which free societies function, which is slightly different than just saying like, let there be an arena where everybody fights it out. Right?
Yeah.
Because when you have the setup of the arena where everybody fights it out, you're suggesting that everybody has equal value in that conversation and that magically like the ones who are most correct will win. That's not always true. What he's arguing is that we need to have at least some sort of societal structures that help people understand, signposts, tools. I think of this as the media literacy component, where it's like, how do you help determine which things are true and which commentators do you trust and where do you look for more context and how do you understand these things? I think that stuff is really important. And that's where I agree with Elliott. And I think that the Cato piece underplays that part and the Tinsley piece also. And Renee is sort of pointing out that this is what good content moderation, good trust and safety work is really all about, is adding in that additional context and adding in more value that help people evaluate content. And I think that's a much more nuanced and complex discussion, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah. And obviously Renee really understands the way that platforms work in terms of how they manage content. And I think that's reflected in that piece. You know what I was thinking, Mike, about the topic of misinformation, having read these pieces, was like, is it in anyone's interests to really end misinformation? Like we kind of almost like suggesting that is the end goal. And I remember reading a piece, I think it was Ryan Broderick on Garbage Day, that basically kind of like said about how misinformation was fun. And, it's entertainment. It's like, it's not necessarily the kind of, or not always the political or, societal kind of grandiose, misinformation that we're all concerned about. It's like pop stars and their salacious rumors about who they've kissed or, that kind of stuff is what he claimed as like the bread and butter of people's extent of misinformation. And I wonder if there's any, until that changes, until there's people really understand that it goes beyond that, whether anybody has sufficient motivation to really end it. Well, I think the incentives are not strong enough.
Yeah. And again, like it depends on, how do you define mis and disinformation, right? I mean, like parody and satire are technically, you could qualify them as mis and disinformation, right? The Onion, nothing in The Onion is true, but it's funny. We like it because, it's misinformation that is entertaining, right? There is value in that. And that's why I think the concern about misinformation, again, is sort of like people are so focused on the idea of like just the blatantly false statement. But sometimes we like that. Sometimes that's parody. Sometimes that's satire. Where the concern is when like people are being tricked or confused, right? And that's where you want the sort of societal pieces in there to help people understand what is true. And it's not clear that like the response should be, well, just get rid of the false information, because that doesn't work, right? Like, that's the point that we keep going back to, is like, as soon as you're focused on like, well, we have to remove this information, you're going to run into problems again, because some of it will be like, well, this is partially true. And then you remove it, and then people are like, well, what are you hiding? And then it becomes a big conspiracy theory. And so, no, I don't think the goal should ever be to like make misinformation disappear. What it should be is to arm people to better understand what is real and how to put things into context, and how to come to a strong opinion that is their own and not one that is purely tribal, right? It can't be, I need to believe this because Donald Trump tells me to believe it.
Yeah. So that even if the definition of misinformation is like misleading information shared by people who believe it's true, you think there's still a case for that?
I think you run into problems once you define it that way. Then the question is, who gets to determine that is misinformation? Who gets to make the decision, right? Because, I can say stuff here and people might argue that like stuff that I just said now is misinformation, right? Because they'll say, well, no, like, there's a clear thing that is true and that is not true. And we should totally get rid of the stuff that is not true. And so, now that you can accuse me of misinformation, you can accuse anyone of misinformation at some point, where people are going to believe in something that based on confirmation bias, because everybody does it. Everybody falls for something that confirms their priors in some sense or another. And that is misleading, but the person believed it's true. And so should that always be stopped? Because then we're just going to be in this constant game of policing what everybody says, and people are going to get stuff wrong. And you don't get the situations where you want people to be able to stand up and say, hey, this is wrong or this is different or whatever. And I go back to the case of in the early days of COVID, there was a Chinese doctor who spoke up and publicly went on the internet and said, we have this new disease that is very dangerous and people are dying at a much greater rate. It's very contagious and it's a concern. And the Chinese government went to him and said, that's misinformation. That's health misinformation. We need you to go online and say that you were wrong and you apologize and you take it all back. And like 3 weeks later, he died, and then COVID spread around the globe. And so it's like, you can't say, well, just get rid of misinformation without understanding like the context of it and the consequences of saying that, because then somebody has to decide who is the misinformation, and they're going to get stuff wrong as well. And you lead to this world where a lot of really problematic things result when the goal is like, we have to get rid of misinformation. Again, the best way to compete with it is like, give people the tools to put it into context and to understand it and to evaluate it. And, the more we can do that, the more we can let people, it lessens the power of the misinformation if people aren't as willing to be taken in by it.
Yeah. I think there's certainly it definitely feels like there's a kind of very, a US and a kind of slightly rest of world discrepancy there in terms of those views. And I think that's borne out in these pieces, which I think make it so interesting and why we wanted to talk about it today.
Yeah.
Also, imagine if one of our listeners or somebody decided to accuse the content moderation podcast of misinformation. That would be...
Oh, it'll happen.
That'd be bad for business. That would be... But maybe maybe it wouldn't be. Maybe we'd get a lot of press coverage for that. Who knows? Okay, we've gone deep on that. We've gone very deep on that. But it's a great series of pieces, long form pieces that are well worth reading. As you can tell from our conversation, there's lots in there, and really recommend taking some time on those. On to now a topic that I talked about with our guest host a couple of weeks ago. Ctrl-Alt-Speech isn't a labor rights podcast, but it is somewhat turning into that. And
I have a degree in labor relations, Ben, right?
Do you?
I do.
I had no idea about that. Tell me more. What made you go into study labor rights?
My undergraduate degree was in industrial and labor relations, because I thought I was going to become a lawyer, and it was actually a good pre-law program. And then I didn't go into law. But yeah, no, I have books on my shelf that are like the, history of labor. And I had to take 2 years of labor history. I had to take collective bargaining, negotiation, arbitration, a whole bunch of other stuff. Labor economics. This is my wheelhouse, Ben.
This is, I'm talking to the converted. This is, well, this is good. So, I mean, this is a topic that I have long covered as part of the newsletter and in various guises. But, the latest story that I wanted to talk about today was an investigation by an Irish publication called The Journal, which has done another investigation into the mental health of moderators at an outsourcing company working for a platform. And in many ways, this is no different to the others that we've talked about on the podcast, where moderators in Kenya and in Turkey and in Colombia and the Philippines have all suffered mental health issues as a result of looking at egregious content that goes on to be published on platforms. I think what's interesting with this story, Mike, is the fact that content moderation and AI data labeling and annotation are becoming so symbiotic now. And we've known about that in the context of contexts like Kenya and in Ghana, where a lot of those teams working for outsourced companies do both. But this is actually happening in Ireland as well. A company called Covalent, which is not a very large BPO, but certainly has some big contracts, including with Meta, has been accused essentially of making their staff write prompts about suicide and self-harm, which have led to suicidal ideation and self-harm for the moderators, for the workers themselves. So again, it's a very similar pattern of behavior where a worker is having to man a queue, do tasks that have an effect on their kind of mental health and self-harm. And there's lots of detail in there. It's interesting to me that there are more moderators speaking out about this. Probably 5 or 6 years ago, that wasn't going to be the case. The original story about content moderators at big BPOs was a real surprising story because Casey Newton at Platformer had somehow got them to talk. And we're seeing more and more of this happen all the time. And it tells me that there is a kind of movement building, I think, around what's acceptable. And this kind of, the fact that we haven't learned anything, I think, from the issues that content moderators at BPOs have focused on in the past. And we're now going into this AI era where companies are being paid a lot of money to train data and build models and that those are being kind of rolled out globally with the same issues at play, the same mental health concerns and the same lack of well-being checks is really the story here, I think. And it goes into a lot of detail. Employees were asked to essentially pretend to be pedophiles. They're essentially asked to seek out violent or graphic material in writing prompts that they might submit. And they were doing that 150 times a day, without the kind of protections, I guess, that, you would have learned about, Mike, in your in your undergraduate degree. So it's a kind of additional story in that long-standing narrative about the rights of workers, both in content moderation and AI labeling, which I think are almost the same thing now, to be honest.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of overlap. I mean, the thing that I think is really interesting and struck me is, again, how somewhat disconnected this work is from the platforms themselves, right? I mean, just the fact that there's a BPO in the middle, which adds this sort of level of plausible deniability, but it also adds this way for the platforms themselves to sort of wipe their hands of the responsibility because they can sort of say, or they can contract out and say, we need this kind of labeling or this kind of moderation. Is anyone out there willing to do it? And some companies going to step up, and then they might then even outsource to somebody else as well. Like there are these layers which allow you to sort of push the responsibility and the concern out away from the actual platform itself, which then creates this sort of weird incentive structure that is leading to harm to workers. But at the same time, you're sort of balancing that against, this is the thing that's always come up with the human end of content moderation, where it's like, well, if you don't do any moderation, then you're exposing lots of other people to harm. So effectively, you're putting people in harm's way to protect other people. And you could argue the same thing is true of some of the AI stuff. And so like, I don't know for certain, but it sounds like the AI prompt efforts that we're talking about were designed to figure out how do we deal with a situation where someone is looking for illegal content through AI or looking to generate illegal content through AI or is looking to engage in self-harm. And the system needs to understand what that looks like and react to it. And that feels like what they were probably training for, which then you think, well, in the long run, that should be good because if the systems recognize that better and then don't have to put humans in harm's way or can actually help prevent harm, that's a good thing. But are we harming people in the process of doing that? And that's where like, oh, wow, these are really, really tricky and dangerous trade-offs. And it's not so simple as to say, as with anything that I always talk about, right? Like none of these things are so simple that you say, well, this is obviously bad and horrible and should stop, because what if that is being used in pursuit of building better systems to actually prevent more harm in the long run as well?
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, the other thing to this is that the thing that I think is increasingly I'm becoming aware of is that this is not like an incidental thing happening in one or two parts of West Africa.
Yeah.
This is a story that's happening in Ireland,
Yeah.
where there is a large, obviously, technology industry.
It's happening everywhere. I mean, I think that's like, I think the tech industry has been able to hide some of it by pick your country, right? I mean, it's all over the world, right? I mean, there are stories in the Philippines, there's stories in India, there's obviously stories across Africa, South America, the US, like every country has people in these kinds of jobs. And it does feel like, for horrific reasons, maybe companies sort of tried to hide it in parts of the world that maybe get less media coverage and less attention. But I think it is happening everywhere because there's so much of this work that's happening.
Yeah. And some of this experience is actually borne out in another piece that came out this week, a long feature in the magazine Jacobin, which has its own political leanings. It's a kind of leftist magazine.
They believe in labor rights.
They believe in labor rights. You can't say that we're not balanced here on Ctrl-Alt-Speech, talking about the Cato Institute and also Jacobin magazine.
In the same episode, yes.
In the same episode. But some researchers have written a piece about a report that they've just done in which they interviewed 113 data labelers and content moderators. Again, the idea that they're almost mutually exclusive in a lot of these businesses now, from Kenya, Ghana, Colombia, and the Philippines, and documented all of this mental health harm, PTSD, depression, etc. That kind of brings to life a lot of what we talked about in a really effective way again, Mike. But one thing that they talk about, which we don't really discuss a lot in Ctrl-Alt-Speech and more broadly, I think, is the impact of the NDAs.
Yeah.
So the kind of non-disclosure agreements that tech workers at all levels, including these content moderators and data labelers, sign as part of their employment. And, again, these researchers who are working for a human rights organization, make the point that these NDAs basically maintain the kind of normal structures, the inherent structures that exist and give power to these big platforms and hide the abuse, as you say, that does happen when BPOs don't provide the sufficient protections. And so the NDAs are the kind of key to maintaining the silence of these workers. I mentioned the fact that more and more seem to be breaking those NDAs to talk to journalists and to talk to researchers, but a lot of people aren't. They note that when they reached out to 105 workers in Colombia, 75 of them were too nervous or too scared to talk to the researchers. In Kenya, it was 68 out of 110 that didn't want to do it. So almost 2/3 of workers feel kind of held back about talking about their experiences, their labeling data and moderating content. And so we're really looking at the kind of tip of an iceberg here as to the experiences of these people. And I wonder at what point that dam will break.
Yeah, I think the piece is really interesting. And the researchers had released an underlying report that this was based on called Scroll, Click, Suffer, which is also worth reading and is actually sort of a thoughtful analysis of the impact on these workers. But I do think the NDA piece is a big deal. And I understand why companies do it, right? But I do feel like that maybe is a point that should be contested and should be talked about, because the companies effectively are trying to hide this. And I think we're all better off if there was an open discussion about this, and that if these workers were able to talk about their experiences and talk about the struggles that they had, then maybe we can figure out, like, are there better ways to deal with this? Are there better ways to approach it? And we can talk about the actual trade-offs and understand it. When it's totally hidden, then we're guessing. And either we're assuming the worst of the worst, or we're assuming that it's exaggerated or whatever, but we don't have the real information, the real data. And so I do think that I appreciate that these researchers really heavily talked about the NDAs limiting their ability to get the information that they need and how that is problematic. I don't think the companies are going to be quick to sort of, say we're going to get rid of the NDAs, but I think it is a pressure point that we should be talking about. That if these companies, the BPOs especially, but the platforms as well, if they really do believe in, as all of them will claim, they believe in protecting the health and well-being and mental well-being of their workers, and they put in place, they always claim that, they have rotations and they have mental health help and they have all these things. If that's true, like, let them talk. Let's get rid of the NDAs and let them speak out, and let's have these conversations publicly so we can figure out what is the better way to actually deal with these kinds of jobs.
Yeah, and we spoke about Sarah Wynne Williams,
Yes.
the Facebook employee who worked in the public policy team, whose book attracted a lot of media attention, and there was a legal case that we talked about where the company tried to prevent it from being published. These NDAs are affecting people not just at the lower levels, but even the really senior folks who have subsequently left the companies and have been out in the world for years and years. So they're a powerful thing, and these two pieces definitely highlight that, I think, in a way that, again, I hadn't really thought about. So lots of good stuff there. Mike, we've come to the point of the podcast, as we always do, where we will attempt now to quickly go through some stories that we will inevitably struggle to summarize.
I think we have time for one quick story, maybe.
Yeah. Well, it depends how quick we want to talk.
Okay.
So let's start with the one that you flagged, the Brazil Supreme Court story. This is our second Supreme Court story of the day.
Yeah. And in some ways is related to what we've been talking about throughout the podcast today, which is that, so Brazil, I forget when, I should have looked it up before we started recording, years ago, about a decade ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, passed a law, a civil liberties law referred to as the Marco Civil, which presented a bunch of sort of civil rights and civil liberties for internet usage. And it was generally considered really, really good, very, very thoughtful. A lot of work went into it. A lot of thought went into it. Very supportive of civil rights and free speech of people in Brazil. There's a Supreme Court ruling that's been in process where like different judges would report kind of where they stood on this particular issue over the last few weeks. So we knew that this was coming. And I wrote something about it about 2 or 3 weeks ago, in which they sort of effectively overruled a piece of the Marco Civil, which had been an intermediary liability rule, similar in some ways to Section 230, slightly different in that what it said was that if a court rules that some content is illegal, then a platform intermediary will have to take it down. But before that, they're protected from liability if they don't know whether or not the content is illegal or not. The Supreme Court effectively ruled that out and now says that the platforms need to be much more proactive in removing content that may later be deemed illegal or harmful. And that is a kind of thing that I think sounds good to a lot of people who have no experience in this space and don't understand the actual consequences of it. And I talked about this a little bit and got yelled at by a lot of people in Brazil.
Yeah, talk about when you wrote a thread about this on Blue Sky.
So I wrote about it on Blue Sky, and I basically said there will be very bad consequences to this, and it will make it much harder for there to be social media apps operating in Brazil, and there will be other problems. And it's tough to write out in detail on a Blue Sky thread, and so people took issue with it, and certainly I got accused of colonialism and trying to enforce the First Amendment on Brazil and things like that, which was never my point and never my intent. In fact, the Marco Civil is not consistent with the First Amendment, but I still thought it was a very good law, and I actually supported the existing approach. And so the problem is that I think people are looking at this through the lens of Brazil has gone through quite an upheaval, and they had a Trump-like figure who is now being tried and has been indicted and all this kind of stuff. And they're sort of trying to deal with the amount of misinformation and an attempted coup. And they've had dictators in the not so distant past. And so the country's trying to deal with the fact that you have a number of bad actors. And my point is that when you set up a system like what the Supreme Court has now just blessed, is that when those people inevitably get back in power, they will abuse those tools and claim, as Donald Trump is doing now, claim that any kind of critical information is misinformation, is harmful and needs to be taken down and will threaten the platforms. And it's the same mechanism that China used to create the Great Firewall, which was basically saying, we're not going to tell you what to take down or what to leave up, but if you leave up any content that we later deem harmful, you will be punished for it. And that leads very quickly to overblocking and removal of all sorts of information, including information that may be truthful and may be critical of, let's say, a wannabe dictator. And so you have to be concerned about the consequences of this. And we've seen some, as this ruling has come out now, we're seeing more and more people, including people from Brazil who are not colonizers from the US, talking about the potential dangerous consequences of it. And so Rest of World had a really good piece that had quotes from a number of people. EFF had a series of posts. Tech Policy Press also had a series of posts that look at the potential negative consequences of this ruling in Brazil that will force intermediaries, force platforms to be a lot more aggressive in pulling down content before it's ever been deemed harmful or illegal by a court.
Yeah, and if we try and kind of place, I guess, this story in the spectrum that we discussed earlier around misinformation, because this is kind of a misinformation
Yes, sure.
result, really, isn't it? Like, you've got Cato Institute thinking that misinformation is an overstated threat, Elliot Higgins thinking that it's a significant threat, but doesn't need to. There needs to be some kind of key foundations and underlying changes to the way that we communicate. You've got Ready to Rest, they're treading a fine line between kind of platforms deciding. And then you've got Brazil,
Yes.
in the kind of opposite end of Cato in many ways, saying like, no, we'll have the courts decide. The platforms can pull down.
I mean, the old system was that the courts decided, but here they're saying like the platforms have to decide before the courts decide.
Right.
And so it's even more extreme. And again, like I want to be clear, because sort of beaten into me by people yelling at me. Like, I understand why people in Brazil are concerned about misinformation online and that it has been abused and it has led to really bad situations. I just think that this will lead to further abuse, and I think people really need to be aware of that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's an interesting update to a story that's long running. I will just finish by flagging a story. I don't know how often we've mentioned Elon Musk on this podcast, Mike, but it feels like
Today?
a long time ago. Not at all today. I'm gonna bring him up right at the end.
But in the past few weeks, we've been sort of Elon free for a while.
Yeah, exactly. I'm feeling better for it. But X/Twitter has actually announced this week that they will be opening up community notes to AI note takers. And I think this is a really interesting development that many people will be fascinated by. You might have seen, I don't think we talked about it on the podcast, that it was reported about a month and a half ago that the number of community notes had completely fallen, completely tanked. It'd gone, I think, dipped 50% in the course of 4 or 5 months, partly as a result of, I think, Elon saying that the note system had been commandeered by some governments and was being used as kind of interference, which you shouldn't do for your own product.
Yeah.
Either way, there's a huge decrease in the number of notes being shared. And so they've come up with this ingenious idea to have AI note takers, and people will now be able to create bots that check posts for their validity. They will still be voted on with the kind of bridge algorithm that Community Notes is known for, so they won't be immediately available, but there'd be essentially a kind of increased throughput of notes that will then be voted on by humans. Lots more to say about that in the future, but basically we're all going to be critiqued by AI bots in various forms, Mike. So, just a flag, get used to it. Be ready for it.
I mean, I think it's interesting, right? As an experiment, it's really interesting, and it has the potential to actually to make community notes more useful, but also the potential to make it complete garbage, right? And so we really won't know until it's enforced, right? The big complaint with community notes was that it was a very slow process, and by the time a note would show up, it was probably too late. Most people had already seen the mis or disinformation. If you could have the AI be 1, accurate, and then 2, quick, like it could be more useful. But does anyone actually believe that's going to be the case? I don't know.
No, it doesn't seem like it, does it? Anyway, that brings us to the end of today's episode, Mike. It's been great to have you back here with us. I hope that the holiday has left you and this podcast has left you in a kind of improved state of mind. Just want to thank all the publications that we've been able to reference today: Irish Times, The Journal, Jacobin, Cato Institute, Byline Times. Again, important to give these guys a shout out. Thanks for listening to us. And if you enjoyed today's podcast, don't forget to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll be back next week. Take care. See you soon.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's CTRL-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.